I want to bring in NBC's Gabe Gutierrez covering the White House. NBC's Andrea Mitchell conducted that interview with the Finnish president. And Ben Rhodes served as President Obama's deputy national security advisor. He is also an MSNBC political analyst. So, Andrea, I know that you also asked President Stubb about this meeting between Zelensky and Putin. He seemed to think it was happening. What do we know for sure?
Well, he suggested that it could happen within a week or two, relatively quickly, that the security guarantees, he said, are up to us, not to Russia. I asked him about Russia's immediate rejection from their foreign minister, Lavrov, almost as soon as the meeting broke up, and saying that there could not be any NATO presence. And he said, we've been talking about this among the 30 nations, the Coalition of the Willing. Chancellor Merz called another meeting for today, a virtual meeting of that group. They've been working on the military possibilities, and that this could happen rather quickly, that the security guarantees are not a decision for Russia, that he said that is up to us. And he takes a very hard line as a country with an 800-mile border with Russia, a relatively new member of NATO, which joined NATO precisely in 2023 in response to Russia's invasion, and has a very strong military, is a very strong contributor to NATO, and has and keeps purchasing, warplanes and other military equipment. So they are very well armed indeed.
So, Gabe, what is the White House doing right now to put a meeting on the calendar?
Well, Chris, there are active negotiations underway to try and make this happen. But as you suggested, right now we don't have much clarity on all this. Now, yesterday it was very interesting to hear President Trump speaking with French President Emmanuel Macron in a hot mic moment where he talked about the possibility of coming to a deal with Vladimir Putin. Let's listen to that.
I think he wants to make a deal. I think he wants to make a deal for me. You understand that, as crazy as it sounds?
Now, critically there, Chris, the president saying that he thinks that Putin wants to make a deal, quote, for me. Many national security analysts would say, well, look, Putin's really only in it to make a deal for himself. But there are many questions about the location and the timing of this potential meeting between Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky, partly because there are a lot of countries around the world that Vladimir Putin can't simply go to. Of course, the International Criminal Court has indicted Putin. Those are some of the countries right there on your screen that are not part of the ICC. Turkey, Belarus, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all those are places where there could be some sort of summit between Putin and Zelensky where Putin would not be arrested. Also interesting, though, President Macron suggesting that perhaps Switzerland could be a potential location for this. Switzerland is part of the ICC, but now is saying that it would grant immunity to Vladimir Putin if he came to the country for any sort of peace conference. But, Chris, these are all questions, the timing, the location of all this, certainly the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, will be pressed about at the White House briefing within the next hour or so.
So, Ben, and you and I have talked about this a lot in the past. Just talking in diplomatic terms is important. Clearly, a lot of talking was done yesterday. We saw the European leaders. We know that phone call took place with Vladimir Putin. So are we in a better place moving forward? And by better place, I mean more likely to be able to achieve peace than we were 24 hours ago?
I mean, it doesn't really feel that way, Chris. I mean, we're in a better place in the sense that it's pretty clear that President Zelensky and European leaders, made their case and communicated why we can't just, from the standpoint of the West, capitulate to Putin in this. But there are two big issues that you and I have talked about several times, Chris, that are at the core of any resolution. One is land, one is security guarantees. On the question of territory, it is no clearer today than it was before the Alaska summit what the future of Ukraine's borders would be or where the front line would freeze in any settlement. Russia wants all of the land that is annexed from Ukraine, which includes land that they don't even occupy. And that is still Putin's position. That was still Putin's position after the Alaska summit. Ukraine obviously doesn't want to cede that territory, nor do they want international recognition that that territory has been ceded. And then on security guarantees, Ukraine wants something that they can take to the bank, that if they make this deal, Russia's not going to reinvade them in a couple of years. The best way is for them to join NATO, and they have an Article 5 collective defense guarantee. Secondary to them would be a physical presence of troops from NATO countries, and this would be that European collection of countries on their territory, because frankly, what they believe is if NATO countries are attacked by Russia, that does bring in NATO. Russia absolutely won't agree to that, and they've said that again after this meeting, because that's one of the reasons they say that they fought this war in the first place, to keep NATO off their borders. So look, I'm all for talks, I'm all for diplomacy. It's good to try to figure these things out, but let's be very clear, for all these optics, it's no clearer today than it was before Alaska what the actual deal would be.
So there is, again, let's talk just about that one question, security guarantees. I mean, Zelensky told reporters pretty unequivocally that his understanding there would be security guarantees. But this morning, Donald Trump was on a phone call with Fox News, and he put the onus squarely on Europe to provide it. Let's listen to that.
When it comes to security, they're willing to put people on the ground. We're willing to help them with things, especially probably if you could talk about by air, because there's nobody has the kind of stuff we have. There'll be some form of security. It can't be NATO, because that's just not something that would ever happen. They couldn't do that. So who would want that? I mean, if you were Russia, who would want to have your enemy, your opponent, sitting on your line? You don't do that.
So do you hear in that, Ben, any consensus among the president, Ukraine, Europe, about what security guarantees actually means?
I mean, yes and no, right? So on the yes, from Trump's perspective, it seems like he wants there to be European troops, right? Or he's okay with, maybe he doesn't want it, but he's okay with this idea that the UK, France, Germany, and a collection of European countries will put some troops into Ukraine. And I think what Trump thinks of as security guarantees, too, is that, Ukraine will be allowed to buy our weapons, those kinds of things, right? Now, that's not like a concrete security guarantee, but that's an insurance policy for Ukraine. Now, here's where the no comes in. Those troops, what happens if they're attacked by Russia? What happens if Russia reinvades? They're NATO countries, right? Does NATO come to the assistance of those troops? Those troops are in Ukraine. They usually depend on kind of a NATO logistics and supply chain, right, to kind of rearm themselves, to train themselves, right? What is the U.S. participation in that? What is the NATO participation in that? The NATO Secretary General is in these discussions, right? Clearly, these are issues. Vladimir Putin knows this. He's not going to make a deal just to give Donald Trump like a good news cycle here. He doesn't want any non-Ukrainian troops on Ukrainian soil. And so this is a huge gap here. Now, one way to settle it is just to say, as Chancellor Merz says, well, we're not going to seek Putin's permission. But Putin knows that, right? And so this is the question. When you get down to the brass tacks of what does a final deal look like, you have to deal with these things. Otherwise, what you're looking at is kind of a frozen conflict. Now, I think the Europeans would like there to be a ceasefire before you even have these final details hammered out. But Putin doesn't want that. And so that's why we're in this this ambiguous state where Putin can just keep pressing his advantage on that front line while all these talks go on without a ceasefire.
Well, Andrew, in fact, you talked to the president of Finland about that exact topic, about a ceasefire. Let me play that and I'll get you on the other side.
My personal preference would be to have a ceasefire or call it a truce, because that would stop the killing. And usually in these types of negotiations, you first have a ceasefire and then you actually have the peace negotiations. But again, we have to live with the realities that we have.
All of us are very clear that we want to stop the killings as soon as possible. You can call it a ceasefire, you can call it a truce, an armistice, but we want to stop these killings.
So in your conversations, Andrea, and I know they're wide-ranging, is there any level of feeling, any level of belief that they could come to, whatever you call it, but some sort of ceasefire?
The ceasefire is clearly what the Europeans have wanted. They were disappointed, but they quieted that disappointment in order to get through yesterday's meetings and to support Zelensky and also support NATO unity with the United States because of the things that Donald Trump has said in the past, where he has even threatened if, European nations didn't ante up to what he claims are dues, which are not, they're just contributions to NATO. And he said, well, if they don't contribute up to the 5%, then Russia can do whatever the hell they want with them. I mean, he has repeatedly even questioned the Article 5, charter obligation of NATO membership. So they had to navigate this very closely. I think that there are ways, as Ben well knows as a negotiator, and when he was doing, negotiations with Iran and other very complex negotiations, Cuba and the United States, to work around it. There is talk of a buffer zone, some sort of an armistice, not an end as they continue to negotiate, but some kind of no man's land, if you will. Like North Korea, a frozen conflict, so be it, but that it would stop the killing. And there is talk, what President Stubbs said, of getting to the ceasefire before the third, in between the second and the third of the meetings, the bilateral and the trilateral, when President Trump would join. And so getting the ceasefire at least on the table before the end of the talks with Vladimir Putin, but getting some kind of commitment from Russia. So there are different modalities, and what sounds so naive out of all of this is to even suggest that something as complex as land swaps and boundaries could be negotiated in a couple of meetings. President Stubb, by the way, suggested Geneva, and Switzerland today said that they would give immunity to Vladimir Putin to travel to Switzerland. There have been other high-level meetings, President Clinton meeting with Hafez al-Assad that I attended back in the 90s, when he was not on the terror list, but was not considered an ally, certainly. So there are neutral meetings that could be held in Switzerland, and that could be one of the options.